Hi all, I'm finally back. Sorry for the long wait. I was sick the past few weeks and finally starting to sound normal. I notice my voice still sounds a little bit strange, and hopefully I won't be sniffling. I didn't want to go too much longer without reading you the next chapter since it ended on such a tense moment on the Tainted Shore. But it's also really windy today, so hopefully the sound won't intrude too much on the recording. I can just constantly hear this rushing sound. It gets really windy where we live sometimes, and yeah, so can't do anything about that. But I had to take down a wind chime that I put out in front of my office, and I love to listen to the sound, but not great when trying to record something. So anyway, so last chapter was chapter 13. And like I said, they were on the Tainted Shore, and Lyric and Runa's mother, Elena, was attacked by the creatures that were there, and now they're just been hiding in this abandoned house. So yeah, let's just get into it so we can continue the story. All right, chapter 14, Runa. Runa woke to the distant sound of waves washing onto the beach. Her lips were cracked and dry, and when she moistened them with her tongue, she tasted dried blood. A dull pain throbbed behind her eyes. It felt like someone had stuffed her head with wool and slammed a hammer against her temple while she slept. Feeling groggy, Runa swallowed a groan and forced herself to stand, stretching her stiff muscles. The abandoned shed was murky with the door and window closed, but light leaked beneath the warped door and through cracks in the walls. Runa cocked her head, listening for the monsters. All she heard was the waves. Runa pushed back her cloak and ran her hand over her arm. Her sleeves were stiff with blood and salt from the storm. She hissed as her fingers brushed across torn skin. Aware now of her injuries, pain burned down her arm, but she shoved it away and looked down at Lyric, who was starting to wake. Groaning, her sister shifted her feet, unable to move much with their mother still lying in her lap. Kel, stretched out on his side next to Lyric, groaned and shoved himself upright. He reached a hand behind his back and looked up at Runa. Runa knelt in front of Elena and Lyric and steadied their mother's pale face. How is she? Head bowed, Lyric peeled back the edge of the bandage and pressed her fingers against Elena's wrist, taking her pulse. Her pulse is weak, Lyric said. We need help soon. She's lost a lot of blood. Her eyes, wide and exhausted from lack of sleep, shifted to the door. Are they gone? Yes, Runa said. It's daylight. She looked over at Kel. He looked terrible with blood on his face and clothes. His cloak was torn and there were rents in the thick fabric of his pack. What might have happened to their backs and arms if they hadn't worn their cloaks and bags? We should eat, Kel said, looking at Lyric. Try to restore our strength. Runa nodded and reached for her pack. She dumped it on the floor during the night. Her bag bore multiple slashes, but nothing seemed to have fallen out. Not that there'd been a lot inside. Raising her water skin to her lips, Runa nearly drained the whole thing. She hadn't realized she was so thirsty. She popped a piece of dried gull meat into her mouth and helped Lyric free her legs from beneath Elena so she could stand. Can you carry her again? Lyric asked Kel. She winced and bent over, rubbing her thighs. I'll manage. Kel smiled, which made him look even ghastlier, bloodied as he was. Let me check your back, Lyric said. I'm fine. Kel waved her away with his water skin. Runa narrowed her eyes. Why didn't he want Lyric to look at his back? Lyric shook her head. No, I need to check it. She shoved open the window, letting in a beam of light. It's nothing, Kel insisted. What about you? There's blood on your arms. You won't be able to carry Elena if you're bleeding out as we walk, Lyric said. Stop arguing. Her jaw set stubbornly, and she knelt behind him, peeling up his shirt to look at his lower back. Kel stopped her hand with his, preventing her from pushing it up all the way. How is it? He asked. Lyric stared at Kel's back with a curious expression, brows knotted over her eyes. She blinked and looked up at him. Nothing too serious. It's not deep, and the bleeding has stopped. You'll end up with a scar. Her head cocked to one side. What does it mean, your tattoo? Runa raised an eyebrow. A tattoo? Like the one around his throat, or different? She shifted on her knees in a furtive attempt to see, but settled back before either Kel or Lyric noticed. A story for another time, Kel said. He turned his head, giving her an imploring look Runa didn't understand. Lyric blinked and looked back down at Kel's back, pulling down his shirt. It needs to be cleaned and bandaged, but I think you'll be fine until we reach Avern. Normally, I'd advise against lifting anything heavy. Lyric glanced at Elena lying on the floor. Be as careful as you can. Turning towards her, Kel lifted his hand and brushed his fingers along Lyric's jaw. I will. Standing, Kel rolled his shoulders with a pained expression and walked to the door. Runa stood to follow. Not waiting for her help, Kel pushed up the bar and wrenched the door open, sticking his head out into the light. Give me a minute to walk around, he said, looking back at Lyric. Then I'll be ready to leave. Runa stepped into the doorway and watched as Kel walked around the corner of the shed. Then she examined their surroundings. The beach looked different in the morning light. She didn't trust how calm it was, as if their ordeal the night before hadn't happened. She'd been so focused on staying alive, on moving and fighting, that she hadn't realized how close they'd come to dying. That she was still here, battered and bloodied, left her with an incredible heady feeling. Runa breathed in one deep breath after another, feeling the remnants of fear wash over her until she felt her usual determination take root. Crossing her arms, Runa looked back into the house at Lyric, who was sitting by their mother and staring at her hands. Lyric's fingertips were stained, as if she'd dipped them in red paint. She tried to scrub them off on her cloak as Runa watched, then gave up and pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes. Her hair, a tangled cloud around her shoulders, shifted forward as she bowed her head. Lai, are you okay? Runa asked softly. Lyric jerked and looked up. Her green eyes glistened wetly, and bruises darkened the skin beneath them. As much as I can be. Runa opened her mouth to say something, she wasn't sure what, but before she could, Kel returned. She shifted to the side so he could enter the doorway. His movements were stiff as he brushed past, as if pain had replaced his flesh with wood, rigid and unbending. Should I pick Elena up? Kel asked, walking to Lyric and Elena. Yes, but help me get her pack off first, Lyric said. I'll carry it. Kel slowly kneeled and braced a hand on the floor. Runa walked over to them. She helped Kel and Lyric lift Elena's shoulders off the ground so they could slip off their mother's bag. Like Runa's, the heavy cloth was damaged. Maybe you should transfer her belongings to yours, Runa suggested, as Lyric examined the straps on Elena's pack. She'll still need it. Lyric's jaw set as though prepared for Runa to argue. Runa shrugged. All right, if you have the strength to carry both together. Mine is practically empty anyway, Lyric said, reaching for her own. I'll just roll mine up and stuff it into hers. She did so, then pushed up onto her knees and slipped Elena's bag onto her back. Kel, holding Elena's upper body, glanced at her. Ready, Lyric said. Runa moved out of the way, ready to offer assistance if Kel required it, and watched as he lifted Elena into his arms and pushed himself to his feet. Confident he wasn't about to collapse and dump their mother on the floor, Runa walked back to the door. She paused in the doorway, brushing her fingertips across the weathered wood. They'd almost died last night. How had they survived? The shed didn't look like it could withstand much of an assault. Had the gods been watching out for them? Thank you, Runa thought, sending it to anyone listening. She promised herself that she'd find a shrine as soon as possible and light incense. With how things were going, it couldn't hurt seeking the Trinity's favor. The sun burned high in the sky when they reached Rendeshar's border. Kel had almost collapsed twice since leaving the abandoned house, and for the past 2 hours, Runa and Lyric had walked on either side of him, keeping him upright and sharing the weight of Elena in his arms. They left all traces of the taint behind, and Runa was relieved as she stared at the clean sand. The sea had washed everything away, including driftwood. Breathing hard, Kel stopped and went down on one knee, cradling Elena against his chest. He took a long, shuddering breath and stared at the sand as if not quite seeing it. Runa released Kel's arm and straightened, studying the land with fascination. It was apparent they'd left Thenda behind. Rough black stone rose like a mountain in front of them, altering the coastline from flat, ocean-washed sand to an obsidian wall of flat-topped cliffs that jutted over the sea. The beach narrowed, becoming no more than a thin line of sand between the water and the rising land. Following it with her eye, Runa saw that it disappeared entirely into the water. Foamy and dark, the ocean was more violent here, crashing against the cliffs as if to break them apart. The wind bit against her face and yanked on her hair. There was no question in Runa's mind that this seething surf was indeed the Sea of Screams, and if they wanted to continue north, they'd have to climb the cliff. Searching the black stone with narrowed eyes, Runa spotted a thin trail winding snake-like to the top. There, she said, pointing. There are buildings up there. This must be Avern. Lyric kneeled next to Kel and put a hand on his shoulder, then checked Elena's breathing. She leaned her cheek over their mother's mouth, listening for a long moment before looking up at Runa. "She's weaker," Lyric said. Her voice was distant. "Just a little farther, Cal," Runa said, trying to sound encouraging. She hadn't thought him strong enough to carry Elena as long as he had, and yet here he was, struggling once more to his feet, teeth gritted, the tendons in his neck taut beneath the skin. Together, arms around each other, they climbed the trail, each step agonizingly slow. Once they reached the top, Cal shuffled to a large flat stone and collapsed onto it. Lyric scrambled next to him and caught Elena's shoulders, steadying her limp body across Cal's lap. "You can set her down." "No," Cal gasped. "I'll be unable to pick her up again." Runa looked around. The trail opened up into a long street, bracketed by small houses of dark gray wood. She could see more buildings beyond it, the small town stretching in a long line. "I'll find help," Runa said, looking at Lyric and Cal. Lyric looked up, her eyes moving over Runa's face and body. "You look frightful." "Good." Runa bared her teeth in a grim smile. "They'll know I'm serious." She shoved her hair behind her ears and was about to take a step forward, but paused, looking back at her sister. Healing was never free, and she had no money or anything with which to barter. "Give me Mother's bag," she said, crouching beside Lyric. Lyric, raising an eyebrow, slipped the pack from her shoulder and handed it to Runa. She watched as Runa opened it and shifted around the contents. "Are you looking for money?" Lyric asked. "It'd be in her belt, wouldn't it?" Runa, fingers passing over a small leather journal, nodded without looking up. "Check there, too." Beside Lyric's empty pack and the journal, Runa found several pieces of dried fish, a small figurine carved from black stone, a bundle of tightly rolled clothes, a silky letter sealed with black wax, flint and steel, a water skin, and soap. "Nothing useful," Runa said, shoving everything back inside. "Here," Lyric said. Runa set down Elena's pack and looked up, accepting a small leather pouch from Lyric. She shifted it in her hand and heard the clink of metal. "There's some gold in there." Lyric's eyes were wide. "More than enough for healing." Runa nodded. "And she had this." Lyric lifted a fabric-covered bundle from her lap and peeled back a corner of the wrapping. A pendant glinted in the sunlight, a gorgeous stone of red and orange. Finely spun gold cradled the large gem and twisted across its surface in the intricate shape of a dragon's head. "A dragon eye stone," Kel breathed, staring at it with wide eyes. "Do you know what that's worth?" Runa felt her mouth go dry as she stared at the necklace. A strange hunger rose in her chest, stirring like a thing waking. "Cover that up," she said quickly. Runa looked around them suspiciously, worried someone had seen it. Rewrapping the pendant, Lyric returned it to one of the pockets on Elena's belt. "We can't sell this, obviously," she said. "This must be important to Mama." Runa nodded and tried to clear her head. She would never have imagined their mother owning such a treasure, but Elena was the daughter of a king, wasn't she? The necklace might be but a bauble to the royalty of Rendishar, one that could feed an entire village over the winter. "The money should be enough," Runa said, tightening the pouch's drawstrings. "I'll get help. Stay here." Lyric and Kel both nodded. Runa strode into town. She passed the first house without stopping. It felt neglected, the closed door warped and covered by an old fishing net. In the doorway of the second house just past, an old man stood framed in the door. Runa veered towards him, raising her hand. "I need help," she called. "My mother is injured and—" Mumbling something she couldn't hear, the old man backed into the house, shaking his head. He pulled the door shut as she stepped onto the front step. Blinking in surprise, Runa moved to the next house. She caught sight of a face in the window and strode towards it, scowling as a pale hand yanked the curtain closed. "Help!" Runa yelled, pounding on the door. "I need a healer. Please, my mother—" "Help me. Do you have one here? Tell me where to go." She pounded again, the wood scraping her fist, but whoever was inside didn't answer. Hissing in frustration, Runa kicked the door with her foot and spun away, continuing up the street. She knocked on the closed doors of 2 more houses, receiving no answer, and was passing another when she saw the ruined foundation of a house that seemed to have recently burned to the ground. She hesitated in the street, staring at it. What had happened here? Unimpeded by the blackened ruins, the wind rushed at her from the sea beyond. It yanked Runa's cloak over her shoulder and filled her nose with the smell of old smoke and brine. Slapping at the fluttering fabric, Runa continued, passing a blacksmith shop. Like the houses, the smithy was closed, the forge cold. An old sign creaked in the wind, making her wince. "Where is everyone?" Runa growled. "Help!" she yelled, turning slowly. A bird crying overhead was the only response she received. At the end of the street, Runa caught sight of an inn and stable, sitting between a line of half-dead, wind-stripped trees and a large, bleached skull of some mammal. An old wooden sign nailed above the door named the building the Seabird. Setting her jaw, Runa strode towards the weathered building and wrenched open the door. The room was dim, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the low light. Narrow but clean, the inn's common room overflowed with benches and tables, some occupied with the missing residents of Avern. In one corner sat a squat fireplace, inlaid with seashells. Large windows in the back let in the feeble light, the wooden frames filled with diamond-shaped panes of glass that overlooked the angry sea below. Looking to the left of the door, Runa observed a man and woman laughing and sorting linens at a long bar. The man, bearded and broad-shouldered, ducked away as the woman slapped him with a napkin. The woman snorted and shook her head, her brown eyes twinkling. She was plump with a kindly, heart-shaped face, her brown hair combed back into a bun. Eyes slipping to Runa framed in the doorway, the mirth slipped off the woman's face as she took in her bloodied appearance. Her eyes widened, her flushed cheeks paling. Beside her, the man abruptly stood up. His eyes narrowed, and he reached beneath the bar. Hefting the money pouch in one hand, Runa strode towards them. "I need a healer," she said, her voice carrying louder than she'd attended in the small room. "What happened to you?" the man asked. His eyes were suspicious, and Runa narrowed her own in response. Did he think she was dangerous? "We don't want any trouble here," the woman said coldly. "Trouble?" Runa asked. "Will hardly be trouble to you. Please, a healer. I can pay." The man shifted, his chest swelling as he lifted a cudgel in his hand. "We?" He held the club low, but there was a threat in the way he steadied her. "Who is with you?" "We're wasting time," Runa snapped impatiently. "Do you have a healer or not?" Forehead wrinkling, the woman laid aside the napkins and brushed her hands on her skirts. She stared at Runa's red hair. "Who's injured?" "My mother," Runa said. Sympathy softened the woman's frown, and she walked around the side of the bar. The man hissed something at her, but she ignored him. "Was it the Sireni?" "What?" Runa frowned. "No, we came up the shore." "Up the shore?" The woman glanced back at the bearded man. He seemed to lose some of his wariness, and slipped the cudgel back beneath the bar before coming around to join them. "We were attacked by some kind of animal." Runa wasn't sure what to call the nightmarish creatures. Had anyone here seen one? If she started talking about monsters, would they think her mad? "The creatures," the woman said uneasily. The look on her face mirrored that of Runa's neighbors back home whenever they discussed magic. "We have a healer. Granny Gertrude." "Elias!" She pitched her voice over the room, drawing the attention of a small boy who scurried up. "Go fetch Granny Gertrude at once," the woman ordered. "Be quick about it." The boy looked at Runa, his eyes wide. "Now, Elias," the woman said, shooing him with her hand. "Yes, ma." He spun on his heel and ran off through the door Runa had entered. It slammed behind him. "Did you and your mother travel alone?" the man asked. "Where is she?" Runa shook her head. "No, with my sister and a friend. They're with my mother at the entrance of town. Should I bring them here? Where does Mistress Gertrude live?" "Oh, my dear, don't worry about that," the woman said. "You look about to fall over. My husband Jim will fetch them. Here, please sit down." She gestured towards a table. "I'm Maggie. We own the Seabird." "No, I can go," Runa said. No, Maggie said. "I insist. Please sit." Eyeing her, Runa nodded reluctantly. "I'll bring them here, miss," Jim said. "What are their names?" "My sister is Lyric, and our companion is Kel. I'm Runa." Jim nodded. "I'll get them right away. Elias will bring Granny here." He headed out the door. Questioning her decision not to follow Jim, Runa let Maggie lead her to a table. She sagged onto the bench and felt exhaustion settle over her like a water-soaked cloak. She rested her hands in her lap. They felt impossibly heavy. The room was quiet, too quiet, and when Runa lifted her head, she saw some of the people staring at her. They eyed her suspiciously, more hostile than she'd expected. There was an undercurrent in the room she didn't understand. "What happened here?" she asked, looking at Maggie. "I saw a burned house." Maggie looked at her, the anxious look back in her eyes. "By your hair, I'd guess you to be Renda Sharon. You haven't heard?" Runa raised an eyebrow. She'd never ascribed any significance to the color of her hair. "Heard what?" "There was a great battle 3 weeks ago. Our entire royal fleet gone to the bottom of the sea. 10 wind racers and 10 dragon lancers. We know about ships here, you see." Maggie smiled, though it didn't touch her eyes. "Well, not all were destroyed by the Sireni. Some survived but were badly crippled, and King Rakarn ordered them burned before they fell into Sireni hands. Since then, the Sireni have grown bolder, coming ashore and burning homes. Maggie's lips tightened. They haven't tried to burn us out completely, thank the Trinity, but perhaps they don't think it's worth the effort. The entire fleet? Aye, Maggie said. You thought they attacked us, Runa said with realization. That we might have led some here? The thought crossed my mind. Maggie gestured at the subdued room. And likely theirs as well. You look dreadful, dear. Quite fearsome. Maybe Granny should examine you. It's not as bad as it looks, Runa said. I have cuts and scrapes, nothing serious. Exhaustion pressed again behind her eyes, dragging her towards sleep. How much for a room? 2 silvers per night, Maggie said, and 4 coppers for a hot meal. Runa nodded, thinking about the gold in Elena's purse. Unfortunately, I only have 1 room available, Maggie continued. Lucas Weldon's house, the one you saw, was burned by the Sereni last week. He's been living here since. I do have a cot in the stable for your friend. Hopefully he's not afraid of horses. That'll be fine, Runa said. Kel had surely spent many nights in barns and beneath the open sky, traveler that he was. The inn's front door opened and Lyric stepped through. She held it open for Jim, who strode in carrying Elena. Kel followed on his heels, head bent wearily. As Jim passed, Lyric looked around and saw Runa. Her face softened with relief, and she walked towards her. Let's get you to a room, Maggie said, glancing at the locals. Follow me, please. Runa stood and Lyric clasped her arm, squeezing gently. Jim said they've sent for a healer? Lyric asked as they walked towards the stairs. Runa nodded. She's coming here. They climbed to the 2nd floor, following behind Jim and Kel, and stepped out onto a landing that was barely wider than the stairs themselves. The hall was dim, but someone had hung paintings on the dark wood paneling. Runa craned her head, trying to examine them as they passed. Maggie stopped at the last room on the left and opened the door, shifting back so her husband could carry Elena inside and lay her on the bed. Giving his wife a quick look, Jim squeezed past them and headed back down the stairs. The room was too small for everyone, so Kel stayed in the hall. He sagged against the door frame opposite Maggie, his arms hanging limp. Touching Kel's shoulder as she passed, Lyric immediately went to the bed. She dropped her pack and leaned over their mother, listening to her breathe. Do you have any comfrey? Lyric asked, looking back at Maggie, who still stood in the door with Kel. For a poultice? Comfrey? No, I'm afraid not, Maggie said. You know herbs? Yes. Lyric gestured at Runa. My sister and I are wise women, but we left behind our supplies. Granny might have what you're looking for, Maggie said, or something similar. I'm not sure that herb grows here. She eyed them. Where are you from? Olaporia, Runa said, remembering Elena's response to Mira. Oh, Maggie seemed confused. Runa remembered her earlier assumption that she was from Rendishar. But our mother's family is here, in Rendishar. It's our first visit. Maggie nodded, seeming soothed. She turned to Kel. This is our only available room, but I have a cot in the stable you can use. It's clean and warm. Kel smiled tiredly. That's fine, thank you. Good, Maggie said. Granny will be here soon. I'll get hot water and towels. I'm sure she'll ask for them. I can show you to the stable. She studied Kel shrewdly. It looks like you're injured too. There's blood on the back of your shirt. Jim can take a look at your back if you like. He's sewn up more than one sailor who cut himself on the rocks round here. No, Kel said, a touch too quickly. He smoothed his face into a smile as Maggie frowned. No, it's all right. Lyric looked at it already. I'll be fine once I get cleaned up. All right, Maggie said, but don't go bleeding on my floor because you're trying to impress the girls. Kel flushed, eyes darting to Lyric. Honestly, I just need to bathe. Maggie relented and rested a hand on her hip. I can take you to the stable now if you wish. I'll have Jim bring you water. Afterward, if you're hungry, you can eat dinner in the common room. My Jim makes a delicious stew. Kel looked at Lyric. Go ahead, Lyric smiled. There's nothing you can do now. We'll be fine. Here, Runa said, fishing in the money pouch. Avoiding the gold coins, she handed a mix of silver and copper to Maggie. For our room and evening meal. How much for Kel's cot? No charge. Maggie smiled and took the handful of coins, slipping it into an apron pocket. There's a bathing chamber downstairs if you'd like to use it after Granny arrives. Don't forget to see to your own injuries. She gave them a stern motherly look and then turned back to Kel. This way, Mr. Kel. Kel glanced at Lyric again, then flicked his eyes to Runa, who nodded. Runa closed the door as Maggie and Kel left and turned back around. Lyric was examining their mother's neck again. How bad is it? Runa asked. As bad as you thought? She walked to the bed and looked over her sister's head. Yes. Lyric's eyes were large and worried. We can't lose her, Rue. Not if we got her back. Bone-numbing fear tingled through their bond and filled Runa's chest. She gasped, surprised by the return of their connection. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Runa reached for her sister's hand. I don't know what to do, Rue, Lyric said. She's still unconscious, though perhaps that's a mercy. Her breathing is so faint, and her wound... I'm not sure how to even sew the... She breathed out raggedly. There's muscle and bone, and... Her fingers tightened on Runa's. She's strong, Runa said. No matter what she thought about their mother's choices and their abandonment, Runa knew Elena was as fierce and relentless as a mother wolf. She wouldn't die on her back in bed. It was impossible. A brisk knock on the door cleared Runa's head. Come in, Runa called. The door opened, revealing an elderly woman holding a large canvas bag. She was shorter than both Runa and Lyric, which was rare considering their height, and had thick white hair gathered in a braid that brushed the floor. Wide and sturdy, the old woman's shoulders were strong and her back straight, a rare thing to see in a person her age. Her bright blue eyes were alert and set in a brown face wrinkled by the sun. I'm Gertrude, the woman said, looking them over. She didn't smile, but her eyes were not unkind. She shifted her gaze to Elena and walked forward, closing the door. Runa stood and shifted awkwardly out of the way, her tired legs protesting as she did so. She crossed her arms, tucking them against her waist, and watched as Lyric moved to the wall so Gertrude could stand by Elena's side. Setting her bag on the ground, Gertrude bent over their mother and unraveled the bandage. Good field dressing. You likely saved her life. Maggie said you came from Thenda? Yes, Lyric said. She hovered, hands clasped against her chest, a step behind Gertrude's left elbow, watching the woman closely. A creature did this, then? Gertrude asked. Her tone was surprisingly matter-of-fact. Yes, you've seen this before? Runa asked. An injury like this? Once, Gertrude said. Someone knocked on the door, and Maggie's voice called through the wood. Hearing their permission to enter, the innkeeper carried inside clean towels and a large bucket of water that steamed as she placed it on the floor beside Gertrude. Lyric was forced to move again, her back hitting the wall beneath the high window, letting light into the room. There's a basin beneath the bed, Maggie said. She eyed Runa and Lyric. Find me when you like to bathe. Giving Gertrude a respectful nod, she left and closed the door. Maggie said, This is your mother? Gertrude asked. She reached beneath the bed for the basin and placed it next to the bucket. Yes, Lyric said. Her name is Elena. I'll clean her wound, Gertrude said, and sew together what I can. I'm not sure she'll be able to speak once she heals. The muscles in her neck are badly torn. There's also the mage sickness on her. Mage sickness? Runa asked. She studied her mother's pale, sweat-beaded face. Yes, I've seen this before, Gertrude said. The creature fed on her magic and poisoned it, and then it got back in. I can't fix that. I'm not a mage. I can stabilize her, focus on the physical injury, but you'll need a dragon bless to heal this wound fully. A what? Runa asked. Gertrude glanced at her shrewdly. A mage healer. And if we can't find one, Runa asked. Then she'll die. Perhaps in a week, maybe less. Lyric gasped and moved to Runa's side, grabbing her arm. Where can we find a dragon blessed? She asked, her voice shaking. Wrathguard's Hold, I'd say. You may find one elsewhere, but I expect they've all gone to the capital for the Feast of Souls. Can we send for one? Runa asked. A raven, perhaps? We have no messengers here. You can ask Maggie if she knows someone who might volunteer to go on your behalf. Gertrude eyed them. You should get cleaned up. Wash all that blood off. We want to stay, Lyric said, holding Runa's arm. There's nothing you can do now. Gertrude soaked a cloth in the warm water and started cleaning Elena's throat. I'll bathe your mother and tend to her wound. You may need us to move her, Runa said, eyeing the small woman. Gertrude's lips quirked. No need. I have done this many times. You won't be any help to your mother if you both collapse from exhaustion. I'll stay right here. Your mother is safe with me. She glanced at their arms. You don't want to get blood sickness if you leave your cuts untreated. Runa looked at Lyric. She's right, she said softly. There's nothing we can do now. She glanced at Gertrude. You'll send for us if anything changes? Of course, Gertrude said. We'll come back as soon as we've cleaned ourselves up, Lyric said. She squeezed past Runa and reached for Elena's hand, holding her limp fingers. Mama, Runa and I will be right back. You're safe. Gertrude is taking care of you. She released Elena's hand reluctantly and turned back to Runa. Runa opened the door, letting Lyric step out into the hall ahead of her. She looked back at Gertrude. The woman hardly seemed the sort to harm anyone, and what would she do to Elena anyway? We'll be back soon, Runa promised. Together, Runa and Lyric walked down the hall and descended the stairs. The sound of music enveloped them, drifting from the fireplace where a man played a fiddle. The room was crowded with more unfamiliar faces. Where had they been hiding? The town had seemed empty when she'd walked its length, trying to find help. She looked for Kel, but didn't see him. Looking to the side, Runa saw Maggie approaching. I'm glad you came down, the innkeeper said, coming up to them. She was carrying a tray with several empty mugs on it. Your mother is in excellent hands with Granny. Your companion is cleaning himself up. I wouldn't be surprised if he falls asleep without eating. Lyric smiled tiredly. Sleep does sound good about now. Can we take a meal in our room after we've bathed? Runa asked. Maggie nodded. Of course. Here, let me set this down. She took the tray to the bar, then led them to a small room behind the stairs. Here's the bathing room. No one will disturb you. I only let our female guests use it, and Jim, when he's been particularly sweet to me. Maggie chuckled fondly. There's a latch there, Maggie said, pointing to the side of the door. I filled the tub with hot water, and there's soap, bandages, and towels on the table. If you give me your clothes when you're done, I can wash them for you. Lyric looked down at her dress, examining the torn sleeve on one arm. I am afraid this is all we have. We lost our belongings on the shore, Runa said, thinking quickly. Do you have anything we can buy? Something simple would suffice. Ah, Maggie said, you poor dears. She tapped her chin with a finger. We don't have a clothier here, but Frederick's daughter Penny is about your size. She may have something to spare. Thank you, Lyric said with a relieved smile. Maggie nodded. Mistress Gertrude told us we need to find a dragon blessed, Runa said. Is there someone we can send to bring one here, a messenger? We don't have runners here, Maggie said. Someone may take the task, but I warn you, given the Sareni attack recently, I'm not sure anyone will be willing to make the journey. We're mostly fishermen here. I can ask... Jim pointed out the burned house, Lyric said. I'm so sorry. One of us will have to go then, Runa said, nodding. She'd assumed as much. She'd been dreading sitting idle, waiting for someone else to track down a mage healer. It'd be better if she went herself. You might not have to travel to the capital, Maggie said. A dragon blessed could have stayed behind in Helden's Rock, despite the festival. The city is less than 2 days away. Runa nodded. Thank you. I'll check there. Find me when you're done, Maggie said, and I'll have food brought to you. Thank you, mistress, Lyric said. Just Maggie. Maggie smiled warmly, then left, closing the door. Lyric shoved her hair behind her shoulder and started unbuttoning her dress. One tub, she grinned. Want to share like when we were kids? I'm not getting into the dirty water after you. The corner of Runa's mouth lifted as she remembered epic battles in the washbin back home. Fine, she said, latching the door, but no hogging the water. Climbing into the large tub, they sat in opposite ends, giggling as their knees knocked into each other. Lyric hissed as the water touched the lacerations on her arms, but after a moment of tentatively dipping into the water, she sighed and sunk deeper to wash her hair. The warm water felt wonderful on Runa's sore muscles. Scrubbing dirt and blood from her skin, she breathed deeply, trying to relax. But the knowledge of their mother slowly dying upstairs crouched at the back of her mind, stealing away her momentary pleasure. This is her fault, Runa thought, then immediately felt ashamed. Their mother couldn't have predicted their ordeal on the shore, and she certainly didn't deserve to die for it. Stepping out of the bath, Runa wrapped herself in a towel and combed her fingers through her hair, braiding it slowly. Lyric joined her, examining Runa's injuries, then tending to her own. Most of their cuts were superficial and could be left alone. Only a deeper cut on Lyric's upper arm and one on Runa's forearm needed to be covered. Cleaned and soothed by the warm bath, Runa and Lyric were slow to respond when Maggie returned and called softly through the door. She gave them a small stack of underclothes and stockings and 2 modest dressings in blue and green with square necklines and long sleeves. The dresses were faded but tidy. Taking their soiled clothing, Maggie left them to dress. The dresses fit well, though a touch snug beneath the arms, and Runa was pleased with how it draped over her legs, loose enough that it wouldn't hinder her movement. Her wanderer boots had survived unscathed, and after a quick clean, she slipped them over her new stockings. We look presentable again, Lyric said. Maybe one of the locals will now be willing to help us fetch Dragon Blessed. Maybe, Runa said distractedly. Considering how the townspeople had looked at her when she'd first walked into the inn, Runa was reasonably sure she'd have to find a Dragon Blessed herself. Lyric certainly shouldn't travel on her own. Someone would take advantage of her. And though Kell had shown bravery and steadfastness during their journey thus far, there was no guarantee he'd return once he was in the capital. Hrothgar's hold was where he wanted to go, after all, though he did need Elena to get into the king's library. No, he'd come back for Lyric, Runa thought. She considered Elena's claim that their grandfather had destroyed Thenda and bound Kell. If that was true, then it'd be dangerous for Kell to go alone. It has to be me, she thought. She'd manage okay by herself. She had no doubts about that. Walking to the door, Runa opened it and looked back over her shoulder at Lyric. I'll pay Maggie for the dresses and let her know we're ready to eat. You can go up to Mother if you wish. Yes, Lyric said. I want to see how she's doing. She stepped into the shadow of the staircase and scanned the room. If you see Kell, can you ask him if he wants to join us for our meal upstairs? Runa nodded. I'll tell him if I can. Good. Lyric looked for Kel again, then headed up the stairs to their room. Runa found Maggie at the bar. The innkeeper was cutting a loaf of dark brown bread into thick slices, her head tilted as she listened to the fiddler play. "Thank you for the dresses," Runa said. "They fit well. How much does the girl want for them?" "Oh, good, I'm glad," Maggie said, looking up. "Just a copper each. She was going to repurpose them anyway." Runa nodded and took 2 coppers from the money pouch, setting them on the bar. "Do you need help draining the tub?" "No," Maggie said, smiling. "Jim will take care of that." She set down the bread knife and looked Runa over. "You look much better. I was worried there wasn't much left of you beneath all that blood." She gestured at Runa's hair. "Your hair is such a pretty shade of red." "Thank you," Runa said awkwardly, her lips pressing into a thin smile. "We were lucky." She eyed the bread. "Can you send up our meal when you're free?" "Of course. I'm going to ask our companion if he wishes to join us or take his meal here in the common room." Maggie raised an eyebrow, but didn't voice whatever thought went through her head. "Thank you for fetching Mistress Gertrude," Runa said. "We appreciate your assistance." Maggie inclined her head, and Runa turned around. She spotted the back of Kel's head in the middle of the crowd. He must have slipped inside while she talked to Maggie. Sighing, she started walking around the side of the room in an attempt to catch his eye. And I think that is a good place to stop. I was hoping that it would be a short chapter so that I wouldn't overtax my voice, but then it turned out to be a long chapter. But yeah, so they have now made it to Avern, and Elena is being helped. So next week, when I read chapter 15, we will find out what Gertrude is able to do to help, and will they be able to find a dragon blessed, and yeah, adventure to continue. So hopefully my voice wasn't too rough. I'm gonna have to edit out a few coughs and things. But yeah, and hopefully the sound is all right, because I noticed that my headphones kept disconnecting from my phone while I was recording. So yeah. Anyway, all kinds of little things happening today apparently. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you're enjoying the story so far. There's a lot more exciting things to come, and I hope that you have a great weekend, and yeah, and get to enjoy some warm weather, hopefully. It finally feels like, actually it feels like spring kind of like got skipped over and it's almost summer. But then with the wind, it has made it a bit difficult for me to get out and do all the gardening that I need to do. But anyway, all right, well, have a great weekend, and I will see you again next week. Thanks for listening. Bye.